You know how to book flights and hotels. All you're missing is a tool to plan the travel experiences you'll have once you arrive. That's why you need Viator. Book guided tours, excursions, and more in one place. There are over 300,000 travel experiences to choose from, so you can find something for everyone. And Viator offers free cancellation and 24/7 customer support for worry-free travel. Download the Viator app now and use code Viator10 for 10% off your first booking in the app. Find travel experiences for you. Do more with Viator.
Looks like you need a vacation. Enter the 5-Hour Energy Where Will the Tide Take You sweepstakes. You could win a $10,000 dream beach vacation. Imagine jet setting off to a tropical paradise, having fun in the sun, or diving at a gorgeous reef. It's up to you. No purchase necessary. Go to 5HETide.com for official rules and to enter. That's 5HETide.com. Enter today. Ends June 30th, 2024.
Hello and welcome to Volume 11 of the Comedy Album Book Club. I'm the co-producer, Matt Ardill. I'm filling in for Jason DeLine, who can't be with us tonight. We just listened to Robin Williams' A Night at the Met. If you haven't already listened to it yourself, we recommend you stop right now and give it a listen, then come back and join us for the discussion. Robin Williams is an Oscar-winning actor and comedian, studied at the Juilliard School, and has over the years appeared in over 108 television and film appearances, ranging from a dog in a movie with Simon Pegg, to Mrs. Doubtfire, 1 Hour Photo, and possibly for me, his most defining role, Mork from Ork, on Happy Days and later in Mork and Mindy. But he's also appeared in stage productions as varied as Waiting for Godot with Steve Martin to Rajiv Joseph's Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo. His work has spanned the world of darkly serious to lightly comedic. One of 20 students accepted into Juilliard in 1973. He attended on a full scholarship and was one of only 2 to be accepted into the John Houseman Advanced Program that year, the other being Christopher Reeves. Classmates included William Hurt and Mandy Patinkin, and the energy of this period that he put out could be best described as manic. It carried over to his work on stage, with Vincent Canby, critic, describing it, the speed delivered the material so intense that it felt as though at any minute the creative process could reverse into a complete meltdown. His stand-up career was not without controversy. Starting in the 70s, he became somewhat of a legend for selling out huge venues within minutes of announcing the dates. During his peak, he's noted to have found the entire process of doing stand-up comedy very difficult. He relied heavily on character work and improvisation, often sliding into characters at breakneck speeds and flitting from one idea on stage to another. Now, the album that we listened to was released, A Night at the Met, was released in 1986 and was his third official album. There are a few albums that predate that, but this is his actual official album. They were bootlegs. It's sort of a breakneck journey through the politics of the day, his demons, and the wonders of fatherhood. Produced by David Steinberg and Brooks Arthur, it continued Williams's habit of collaborating with people who he knew who could bring out the best in him, and also marked his last major appearance in the 1980s, as he then went on to focus on his film career, with Good Morning Vietnam being released the next year. So tonight we have Peter Hill and Sherilyn Johnson joining us. Peter is a retired sketch comedian from Canadian Comedy Award nominees Approximately Three Peters and Beggars Canyon, and former producer of the Toronto Comedy Sketch Festival. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Sherilyn is a veteran comedy journalist who has appeared in publications such as Vanity Fair, AV Club, and the Toronto Star, and has previously graciously appeared with us to discuss the Smothers Brothers live from the Purple Onion. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Peter, you voted on this album on our Facebook group as a album you'd be interested in hearing. So can you tell us what about it drew you to this album?
This album is for me, it's one of my foundational comedy experiences when I was much younger. So I'm almost 43. I was about 11 when this would have come out. I was probably about 12 when I heard it, and that was sort of a period where I was discovering Monty Python, SCTV. It was probably just starting to segue into Saturday Night Live, and this was one of those great audio comedy experiences it was probably my first proper gateway into stand-up. And listening, I have memories of memorizing those jokes and listening to it in prep for this, and again just before we were doing this recording, have been horribly reminded that I claimed a lot of those jokes as my own jokes that I have forgotten the source of. And
you weren't alone.
It's a little meta when it comes to Robin Williams and his stand-up.
It is,
yeah,
because there's probably also a personal connection, like in a weird roundabout way. I always thought that Robin Williams, he had a kind of laugh, like that almost shy, like inhaling type of laugh when he was being like just himself, and his face and that kind of laugh reminds me a lot of my father. And so I remember when Robin Williams, committed suicide when he passed away. That was about 3 years after my father passed away, and it was just like, oh my God, like sort of like dad light, when. So this album is sort of like it's childhood. There's a weird familial connection.
Yeah.
And I would say that there are joke and character styles and voices and whatever that kind of got me thinking about comedy as an outlet for myself.
And Sherilyn, how are you connected to this album? How did it resonate with you?
I played clarinet in the junior high band, and we drove on a bus from Winnipeg to Banff twice. We did it in grade 8 and grade 9. And at one point during those trips, I was like, this is a long damn ride back to Winnipeg overnight. So I figured I'd better buy myself some cassettes, because what else were you couldn't read on a dark bus. What were you going to do? So I bought this album, and I bought Stephen Wright's I Have a Pony on the same day. So very extreme.
You couldn't get much more different than those two.
Exactly. And I don't think I realized until we just listened to it before we sat down, that how much of it I had memorized, like how much of it I knew exactly what was coming next. I must have listened to that cassette, and I probably still have it in a box somewhere. I have nothing to play it on. I probably listened to it hundreds of times.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, it was a few years after it came out that I got it. So my order of absorbing his work is a little bit different. So I'd already seen Good Morning Vietnam. I was already aware of him having a reputation for stealing, because I'd read that in my dad's GQ comedy issue from 1989, I think. I was a typical young comedy nerd. So I already knew a lot about him in a lot of ways, and knew a lot of his work already. So I don't know if that changed the way I viewed that album or made me like it more. But yeah, it was in heavy rotation for sure.
Yes, for me, my dad had been using his material on me for years. So I listened to this album and I'm like, Dad, you're a hack. But I came about it sort of the same age as you, and these jokes were making the rounds of the playground when I was like 11, 12, 13 years old.
Oh, yeah.
It's just, and kids would use them and like, and much like, Robin said, he, joke sampled and just learned from osmosis, and is like, you hang around in these comedy clubs, you kind of forget. every kid claimed, oh no, they made that joke. It was their joke. They didn't get it from Robin Williams.
This is the difference of growing up as a girl with only female friends. We didn't do that on the playground.
Yeah.
I felt like I was the only kid I was the only kid in my social circle who cared at all about any of this. But yeah, that's a whole other discussion.
Now, when I was preparing for tonight, I actually also watched the special, and it's really interesting because I actually found just structurally the album works better than the special. He's so hyperkinetic in his delivery, like he never stops for more than a couple of seconds.
And drenched in sweat too. Right?
Just dripping, and and I mean, in some cases it helps, like the Wells Fargo joke makes very little sense in the album, but there's a giant, carriage right behind him. So in the special, it's like, oh, okay, well, the carriage, that's Wells Fargo, and now the Wells Fargo wagon coming rolling in makes sense. Mm-hmm. But do you find that the album felt a little... If you think about the album, do you find it was a tighter experience than maybe it would have been like live? Because he seems to carry on a bit more in the special.
Well, I did notice a couple of very obvious edits of applause breaks.
Yeah.
So I would have to watch the actual video special, which I think I've only seen clips of. I don't think I've actually sat down and watched it.
It's all on YouTube.
Okay.
Everything is on YouTube.
I know what I'm doing when I get home tonight then.
Yeah. I find some stand-up albums, if there's a lot of visual act outs, he doesn't have a lot of those. I found in this album. I think you can kind of segue through. I agree. There's a couple of really weird applause break edits, like around when he says, "I went to Juilliard," but we've got to have two sort of weirdly a 3/4 applause break and a half applause break.
That both fade out really weird.
Both fade out in a
like
strange way.
Yeah.
But if there's anything that's kind of probably missing is this is Robin Williams in an era where he is like just a ball of energy. Mm-hmm. And I think you can hear that he falls into verbal tics a lot, like, God damn, and, oh, baby, just like, what I mean, or whatever. And he falls into that, but that's probably just like verbal throwaway because he's running from one side to the other, or he's in full stream, which is probably part, a presentational aesthetic that it is more deeply associated with him than a more traditional stand-up. So the album holds up, but I think visually you would have that increasingly wetter Hawaiian shirt wearing post coke head just giving it.
Well, that's interesting because during this album he's in a clean phase in his life, and the energy with which, like, if I didn't know, he's clean here. If he didn't, that wasn't part of it, his act, I'd think, man, that guy is on a lot of coke, because just the energy that he has constantly, there's no difference from the periods when he was struggling with those demons. That energy, that he keeps it up constantly, and his material remains tight. Like, he doesn't lose the joke when he's delivering that, and it just keeps it up at this pace.
A guy with that kind of energy, it's almost like jaw-dropping to think about him on a hell of a lot of coke. Yeah. Like he would just evaporate, travel into a different parallel dimension or something like that. Like, it's ridiculous. I'm not going anywhere with this. It's just
it's just ridiculous. Yeah. Like in this album, you think about his influences that he's talked about, like Jonathan Winters and Peter Sellers. It's really interesting because he has sort of three sort of main groups that he sort of draws from. Winters and Sellers, both very character driven, which shows in all of his bits. He's always got a character to drive the joke home. Nichols and May, who are very structural in it's improv. It was where they got their start, or how they built their material up, but they use that to build the structure. And then you've got, Lenny Bruce, Sid Caesar, Richard Pryor, who all push boundaries a little bit in different ways. And it's almost like you get a smorgasbord of his influences listening to this.
I think it's interesting because I know he had a high level of respect, particularly for Pryor and Bruce. Pryor, kind of as a contemporary, because Pryor was, known for being deeply authentic and challenging in that authenticity. Stories told from his own personal experience, particularly horrible at times. And, you can tell that he's, half this album is built around that, as a reformed alcoholic, cocaine addict, etc. Plus, I think his son is relatively young at this point, is only about 3 or 4 years old. So that's all, kind of broadly accessible, the arc of relationships and ultimately childbirth and childhood. But it's, it kind of runs counter to the fact that even as a kid, drug use and genitalia and sex and stuff like that was older than you, but it felt like it still felt safe. Yeah. It was authentic-ish. Whereas the Winters influence or the Sellers influence, and that kind of style that he had built up as just like manic characters, not really sitting on an idea for too long, like that I think kind of rings out. Personally, I've found that's the stuff that kind of rings out more true. The authenticity, it's there, it's germinating an idea, but he's not going to live in that.
Well, I found even when he had a joke that didn't land, you were still laughing because by the time your brain was like, oh, I didn't like that as much as I think I liked it, he's already 2 jokes down the road.
Oh, yeah, he's gone.
He didn't give you time to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, probably once he delves into his political segment, his Reagan through line of Reagan as an animatronic Jim Henson puppet and the Hall of Presidents, kind of crossing into the Gaddafi stuff with throwaways to I'm going to get the name wrong. P.W. Botha. Yeah, the wonderful leader of apartheid South Africa. There we go. But that was probably the most structural built material.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else, and in fairness, probably the drug stuff. It was once he started to move into the more relationship driven stuff. It was less
looser.
It was looser.
Yeah.
It was more, I'm just kind of gonna go on a story.
Mm-hmm.
This is my stab at authenticity, which, because I'm clean now, it's more of this is about family. This is my place in the world. He doesn't have a grand observation about it, other than I don't know how this is going to go.
But in a way, because listening to it, it was almost like it was 3 acts. It was 3-act play, where the first bit being his demons, his drugs, his addiction, all the hijinks that he got up to earlier in his career. Mm-hmm. Then it's sort of the authoritarian and where's this world going? Are we going to blow ourselves up? And then he's at the end, it's his son saying, fuck it. Mm-hmm. And so it's it does feel loose. The family stuff does, feel loose, but I almost think that's intentional. Is it possible that that might have been his goal, is lull you into a sense of ease with that?
That's an interesting, that's an interesting theory of, look how, starting with look how fucked up I've been, look how fucked up the world has been, and tense, and then just sort of well, here's what life is now. Yeah, that's an interesting theory.
Just because his work, even at its most manic and darkest, his comedy has always had a core of kindness in it, even when he doesn't, even when he's treading where he maybe shouldn't, or maybe is doing it in a way that he shouldn't. He's doing it from always seems to be a genuine place of kindness, and that seems to be any comedian, anybody who's interacted with him, even Mark Maron, the most giant curmudgeon in the universe, seems to be just genuinely enjoy around this guy.
Well, even in Toronto, there's like,
Yeah.
there's the legendary stories of him improvising with, like, I guess that would have been like when Naomi Sneakus was on main stage.
Yeah.
And, sort of the random drop-ins at the Rivoli of the Alt Dot where he would just suddenly pop up and
dropped
drop,
into
like,
Spirits with Joanna's Room, him and Lewis Black the same night, I believe.
That's his bit's actually on. That's also on YouTube.
Yeah.
So I was watching that earlier today too.
But any local comic who had the privilege of sort of being around it, everybody was kind of universal. It was just like he was generous. I mean, there was a little bit of showboating at times, but it's like it's Robin Williams.
Yeah.
You get to do whatever the fuck you want, man.
Yeah.
And everybody like sort of had that same kind of chorus. It's like he was the polkaroo in Toronto comedy for a period there.
There was just a story told online. UCB just had their Del Close Marathon, and it's going to be moving to LA soon. But there's been a lot of stories about the Del Close Marathon, the big improv festival in New York, and their Ask Cat show, which just celebrated an anniversary, which is an improv form that they do weekly. But he guested on one of those shows, I guess in LA, and was really showboating. And one of the performers decided he wasn't going to let him get away with it, and then it didn't go so well when he tried to to rein him in. But these stories keep coming up, and certainly when he died, there was just this like just story after story after story, like all positive about people running into him places, and him picking up the tab for people in restaurants for that he didn't even know, and like. Yeah, it's constant. I don't know if I've ever heard a negative story about an encounter with him.
Yeah, it's funny, like, juxtapose that with like the other comic who has a lot of these random encounter stories around him is Bill Murray. But the Bill Murray stories feel almost like, is he making fun of what's going on right now? Whereas Robin Williams, it always feels genuine. And kind of tying this back to how we got into this particular rabbit hole, and a fun one, is you referencing like the kindness in his material. And I think that's also why sort of in his later career, once he started playing darker villain type characters like 1 Hour Photo and so forth, I think the reason why people reacted so strongly to those, even if the film was transcendent in its success or just not, I think people were always aware of that because you recognize that he was talented and that he could go in there. I think the scary thing for people, and I think at least in my own viewing, the frightening thing was that you could almost relate to the monsters that he was creating, because in some ways, you trusted him, and any character he's played has always had a sense of humanity that is probably at its most honest and pure, because that's part of who he is. So his film roles like Adrian Cronauer or in Good Will Hunting, character name is lost, but those resonated because you believed him because he could convey something that was just a part of his person. And I think even if he is doing something controversial or a bit avant-garde for the time or whatever like that, he never fully pulls away from that.
I mean, and too, like you look at his peers, it was a very interesting period in comedy when he's going, because like, as you said, Richard Pryor was kind of a peer, but like he's also felt like he was almost like a protege of him because he hung in the clubs and during that era. But you also have like oh Jesus, my brain is completely. Here we come to save the day.
Andy Kaufman.
Andy Kaufman, who he would meet in San Francisco in health food stores, and they would just talk. So it's like he had an interesting of that group. Like, how do you think they all sort of came away from that era of comedy out west?
Well, I mean, it depends on which era at the time the special came out, we were in a boom, and similar to, I think, the way we are right now, where there was just so much comedy being produced and on cable, and maybe you can speak to this a bit better, but But talking even the 70s. I mean, was he a Comedy Store guy?
Yeah, his Comedy Store, and when he was in New York,
Improv?
the Comedy Cellar and Improv. Were,
The Cellar.
Yeah,
Oh.
so he talked. Oh, I listened to the Maron interview
Okay.
just to hear him talk about the joke theft accusations, and he's like, "Yeah, no, I just hang out in the olive tree, and I didn't watch the other people. I just went out, did my stuff, and then we just hung out."
That was more recent though, right? That he was hanging out.
It was mostly West Coast based during the
Yeah.
70s.
He was pretty San Fran heavy.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
like that was his kind of home base when he was kind of growing through it. I think the interesting thing though is Robin Williams doesn't entirely feel like a definitive stand-up.
No.
Robin Williams is like, what you'd call in musical theater a triple threat. But he because he did a lot of things and had a lot of natural talents. I don't think stand-up was probably what his... I mean, it made a name for him. It created opportunities for him. His uniqueness was probably more built around... It's the energy level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's the character work. It's probably, to your point, there is an authentic layer of kindness underneath whenever he's being a dickhead.
Yeah.
And I mean, let's be honest, he was never really a real dickhead in his stand-up. There's nothing that he says that's controversial. There's some statements made that are dated, certainly, and references to things that maybe today would be maybe more along Jeff Dunham's line of...
Well, it's interesting going back, like if we do this sort of side beat, given sort of the contemporary conversation around identity and gender and everything else therein. This is for 1986, I was surprised at how unproblematic most of it was. I found, some of the sort of like more gender skewed jokes. A woman president, there would never be any wars except for every 28 days of severe negotiations. Mm-hmm. Some of the voices that, you'd say were appropriated, but were never done as a punch down. It was always about pushing back against some kind of established order. But it feels more hacky now, as opposed to something where you're like, oh, when he's doing certain character voices, it always feels like he's just doing a character.
Yeah.
But thinking back to, as young comedy nerd at this page too, like thinking about the other stuff that you'd see, like in the multitude of television shows set against a brick wall. Mm-hmm.
Oh God, in that era,
yeah, like there weren't a lot of people doing this sort of, kinetic. Like there's Kinnison.
Well, I mean, you had Bobcat.
Bobcat and Kinnison, but they're both very, like, they weren't character driven in the same way.
Oh,
like,
they were the character.
You didn't have him sliding from character to character.
Yeah.
And this just felt more. It just felt more creative to me as a kid at the time. I was like, oh,
Williams was an actor. Well, Williams was a character actor, or an actor with a strong character capability who told partial jokes, sometimes fully formed jokes, but like joke rhythms. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whereas, in an era of where rage comics were starting to emerge, where controversial comics were starting to emerge, the foundations for the confrontationally like blue comedy of the late 80s and into the 90s was sort of in its foundation phase. Mm-hmm. Like he's not the joke writer that some of those, most of the guys are in that era. He's different than them. He operates in the same kind of class and with the same kind of respect, I think, amongst those peers. But he's something else.
Mm-hmm. It's like you said. There's like with the family stuff. There's a looseness to it, and I think it's the feeling of laughter that he's shooting for, as opposed to, it's almost because we not too long ago we did Steve Martin's Let's Get Small, which is not too much before this album, like maybe 5-6 years, and Steve Martin. is a meticulous craftsman in every single element of any joke that he constructs from beginning to end. And so, I mean, like, he's almost like if you had to put it in a graphic arts term, I'd say he's like a draftsman, where he draws every single little nut and bolt and every element of the joke. Whereas it feels like, listening to this, Williams is almost like an impressionist.
Yeah.
He kind of like paints in to give you the feeling of what you're hearing or what you're seeing.
Yeah, or makes it sound that way maybe in some ways. I mean, the whole intro, is sort of constructed, I think, to feel improvised when he's looking around the theater and making the jokes. But like,
he's written that.
Yeah. So yeah, how much of that feeling is calculated?
Well, like when we were talking about the Smothers Brothers when you were last here, it takes a very talented person to seem bad at making music. It takes a very talented person to make something that's being written feel improvised, and he can do that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, really
he
impressive.
can. Well, also kind of like, our shared experience about this is definitely, we were of a much more youthful age when this was a very present and very active album. And I'll admit, I always had hugely fond and monumental memories of the thing. Mm-hmm. But over the years, just sort of lost what the structure was until I listened to it again. It's like, oh yeah. I remember that. But I think to your point, why this thing resonated at that age, there are references that I would not have gotten and did not get. Yeah. Like so many things I was so into at that era. It came with time. I think where his style worked, particularly for me as a kid, was like, I knew who the President of the United States was. I knew sort of who some of the figures that he was talking about. I didn't know who Placido Domingo was. I didn't know who.
Oh, see, I knew that, but I didn't know some of the political figures.
But I knew bits and bobs of some of that stuff. I had no, connection into childbirth or anything like that. But the voices and the if he tells a joke that's built on a reference, I'm probably more into it based on presentation.
Yes.
And then when I get a reference, I'm really into that joke.
Yeah.
I remember being, as a kid, like football coach coaching a ballet squad. This is me as a small town figure skater, or a choreographer coaching a football team. I mean, that shit was gold as far as I was concerned. Because it was just like, I see that. I understand what that juxtaposition is. That's a great gag. Yeah. But I liked, I had been to Disney, so I knew what the Hall of Presidents were. So that equating of Reagan in that context was like, hey, I love that. That's amazing. But I still was along for the ride. I'm kind of lost in a thought, but I think we know what I'm trying to say.
I mean, I had the same situation where I think a lot of the references were lost on me. Like, and even just some wordplay. Like, it wasn't until tonight where I actually got, "Are you Russian?"
Yes.
And I felt so stupid.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, fuck off. I get it. Okay.
No, actually, that was a joke that surfaced for me when I listened to this last week for like the first time as well. I was like, holy shit. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, but there is a joy I also think there's a joy when albums like this that were definitely for our generation foundational, other entertainment from that period. I think of like kind of like legendary things like the SCTV 1984 New Year's episode that is just a deep cut on Orwell, bizarrely, and or there are very specific jokes in Ghostbusters, a movie that was very popular with young kids that are at an nth level above.
Yeah.
That as an adult, re-experiencing some of that, going, oh my God, I for years I've been quoting this, and it's only now that it's kind of sinking in.
I now have the life experience to get that.
The fact that Winston Zeddemore in Ghostbusters is only making $11,500 a year it is 1980s dollars, but that is still gratuitously low. And the fact that that's a, holy shit, that's a great throwaway joke. Like,
I always gravitated, even younger than when I listened to this. I always gravitated towards comedy that worked on two levels, and I only got one level.
Yeah.
Like I honestly, like, there was like a kids show in Winnipeg when I was growing up that I would watch at lunch hour, but the host was always making like jokes to the crew almost in like a Soupy Sales kind of way, and I knew I wasn't getting everything, but I kind of liked that, and I'd watch Warner Brothers cartoons, and there's references, are there references, way over my head, but I kind of knew while watching it, like, oh, some of these references are going over my head. And I don't know why I liked that, and that might be a large part of why I liked this album so much. There's so much more for me to get.
There's almost an evergreen quality to that, because now you can go back and go, oh, I get these things that I didn't get
like
10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I had never seen a penis, so like that.
Just take his word on
gained,
it.
Yeah, that gained new meaning. But yeah, it does sort of evolve as you evolve, I guess, the enjoyment of it.
Well, there's also the kind of following on from that, no, I lost that. Never mind, guys.
Strike it from the record.
Now, for me, listening to his material, it kind of, at least this album, kind of reminds me of Maria Bamford to a certain degree, how using characters to drive home a joke. It's different. Obviously, but dealing with personal demons and dealing with using characters to help hone the joke. I was talking to Jason, and he was saying, he felt that Jim Carrey was very influenced by Robin Williams. Who do you guys feel may have been influenced and derived, adapted or derived lessons from his work in this album, in this era?
I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking about Jim Carrey's like A Natural Act, the Showtime special. Because I don't know if there were. I'm trying to remember what there would be like character-wise in that.
In that era, jeez, or immediately after. I mean, the interesting thing, like. Immediately after, sort of in the period after Williams would have left stand-up, you're going into the late 80s and the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And at that time you've got Carrey doing, sort of transitioning into In Living Color, doing very heightened characters, more heightened than anything else.
At which point he wasn't doing stand-up, I think, anymore, once he started doing In Living Color.
Yeah, so. he had kind of gone off, and he was doing that kind of frenetic character work, and like that sort of like, I guess 1987, 88 probably would have been when he's transitioning out. Mm-hmm. You're seeing, the other kind of like the most, one of the most popular stand-ups of the day was Andrew Dice Clay, where you were completely moving out of, where you were moving away from that kindness principle and getting into like just lewd cuss, you had comedy as blunt force trauma.
Yeah, but I mean there was as much variety then as there is now, because you had your Bill Hicks and you had your Dice and you had that, but then you also had your Seinfeld and you had observational stuff started coming, once Seinfeld became bigger, that became the trend.
Seinfeld,
But I think comedy was trying out a lot of different things in that period. I kind of feel like, I don't know if anybody was really doing Williams much.
But what about era. Now? Like looking at comedians now, do you see anybody who maybe drew from
with
him?
The energy level? I mean, sort of like out of the alt world. Oh, I was going to say like from a more alt world. I mean, Patton Oswalt used to have the energy, but Patton Oswalt doesn't do character.
No, and definitely doesn't have that.
His character is him.
Yeah.
Angry nerd when he wants to be.
Yeah, I mean, who's really physical in that way and frenetic that way? I don't.
We
That's a
moved
really
it.
good question. Yeah.
It's. I mean, if anything, it kind of goes back to something I was saying earlier. It's like he doesn't feel like a traditional stand-up even now. Like because he's an actor who is up there doing stand-up as opposed to a stand-up who is like a pure stand-up like that. You know, you compare your credits like that justifies you as a pro, that allows you to call yourself a thing, like that kind of fraternity or sorority within that world. Whereas I think there was respect that he was allowed to live in it because he was great at it, but I don't think he's specialized.
Yeah. In a way, he's kind of a unique flower.
He is.
And there's nobody quite like him.
He's
out there.
And I think now he's more recognized as just a very authentic, character performer. The stand-up is just one part of it. It's more of as a tool to watch him just do wildly referencey characters. I mean, you could say that if there was something he was doing a lot of was throw in a reference, doing just enough of a reference to get the joke off of the reference to pull you into the next joke and the next joke. And that kind of predated a much more meta era that started to emerge like late 90s, but probably became mainstream around season 3 of Community. Like not that Community was the mainstream piece, but that was sort of the period where suddenly everybody felt like, hey, I got permission to talk a lot about Star Wars tonight. And I think I kind of wonder if anything, that might be what he is more of a precursor of, because what came immediately after him was almost a reaction to everything that those sort of like that old guard had kind of done then. Because when you're thinking about, observational humor or kind of confrontational gross out, or anything that was like weird character or more frenetic was coming out of the sketch world at that time. Kids in the Hall, In Living Color, through Jim Carrey, but also Damon Wayans was doing a lot of that work. Carrot Top, Gallagher. I mean, that was kind of it was much more performance based forms that was kind of carrying on the tradition. Yeah, that would be my armchair argument, I guess, if we're gonna.
Now, I mean, I
in the absence of being able to think of it, I'm sure there was a guy in Iowa who was just the fucking best.
So we have a few questions from the audience. So I think you've kind of spoken to this, but when you think of Robin Williams, do you think of him as an actor or a comedian first?
I think of him as a great talk show guest first.
That's a great answer, actually.
I probably think of him as a stand-up almost last, because it was almost his talk show appearances, and he was one of the last Johnny Carson Tonight Show guests, and he just had that explosive energy. And then I think we all have our specific movies that we immediately think of when we think of him. And then all the other movies that we don't immediately think of, and then then the stand-up. Man,
the death of Jon Stewart's film career.
Oh, it was. I could talk about that too, but films like that, like first ones I saw were Good Morning Vietnam, and I think The Fisher King, which is
Dead Poets Society,
and then Dead Poets Society. It's I guess whatever age you were.
Yeah, I would echo that. I probably discovered him because of the stand-up album, and that his stand-up is probably the least I think of, other than the fact it's just like, hey, that was a really great album, right? Like it is those kinds of characters, Mrs. Doubtfire, Good Will Hunting, and just Robin Williams as a presence, out there. It was, you rooted for him. Yeah. He was a true, in the entertainment world, he was somebody that you rooted for, and there was always a sense of there was a genuine feeling of like, almost like the Sally Field, you like me, you really like me. Him winning an Oscar and for Good Will Hunting. is one of the most moving acceptance speeches, because he's not sad, and but he's truly surprised, and he's a guy who always feels like he's in control, and he still goes up there and does a bit, like he never isn't on, which I think is part of the tragedy for a guy that carried so many demons, that he, when he wasn't on, what was he? And that is a darkness that only he knew and understood.
And talking to that, like the addiction in the early parts of his career, now in retrospect, very much feels like self-medication to address these, like, depression, and especially as a young comic facing a lot of hurdles because being a comic is never easy, especially in a hard room where he talks about constantly getting heckled and stuff like that, and it makes you wonder, what his comedy would have been like if he had been, more effective in dealing with these demons.
It's a hard thing to kind of place, because I mean, some people would point to the fact that he died by suicide, although, and I might be getting some of this wrong, but I think, based on pathology, he was actually pretty advanced in a dementia variation, where he was not healthy, and that was probably magnifying any of those kinds of depressive traits early in his career. I mean, the weird dichotomy with him is, like, his peers were recognizing him as amongst one of the best they'd ever seen. Reeve and Mandy Patinkin and all of his contemporaries were just like, this guy is insane, like, this guy is amazing, and he is given prestigious scholarships and acceptances and things like that, whereas he's still gotta, like, burn it out, like, drag it out. And he experienced incredible success early in his career off a flash in the pan character that resonated on Happy Days. Like, this guy was huge right from the start, but until he wasn't, and he was again, and he was depressed and struggling and addicted, and that guy is a phoenix. Like, he burned and then reconstituted more times than most people get in their lives. Yeah. Which is a fascinating thing. I think, if anything, like, what he became in terms of what everybody thinks about him, his legacy is probably secured by the fact, I hate to say this, because he suffered, because I think people rooted for themselves because they saw this guy come through it.
Yeah. Now,
that sounded so pedantic. I'm so sorry. I mean, good. It's like having watched Nanette recently, and the fact that there's, like, a whole, like, I don't need to suffer for your benefit, like, kind of thread in that particular.
Yeah, I think we're all of our heads are a little bit
skewed by a particularly revelatory stand-up special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Sherilyn, I'm going to start with you. It's the last question for the evening. What was your favorite part of the album, and what would you have left out?
Oh, wow.
Oh, I mean, I think my favorite part was probably all of the drinking stuff, just because it was, there was a darkness to it, but it was also so silly, and I like that contrast. What I would have left out, I as much as it does in its way hold up, if I was making an album in 1986, this came out, I'd be like, well, maybe the Reagan stuff isn't gonna, be evergreen, or maybe, a lot of the political references maybe, wouldn't put on an album, but it's still, I don't listen to it and think like, oh, I wish he'd cut that. Even though, there's a couple of jokes that seem like they were maybe old even then. He's talking about Reagan in a debate and how he was in a debate, but by then, like, when would Reagan's
he was in his second term.
He was in his second term. So
halfway through it.
yeah. So how old was that joke when he tossed it in there? So you go, okay, maybe you could trim that, but also the argument is it can be made the other way. So yeah.
And Peter?
My favorite bits are probably it's the ballet sequence, and yes, drinking, marijuana, cocaine, that whole sequence is just like it doesn't stop right from the moment he says howdy in the opening, and then kind of runs it through. That's just glorious. I think my observation listening to it now is that a couple of the jokes are a bit offside now, kind of with contemporary flavor, certainly around the Gaddafi sequences. But it's pretty fascinating. The thrust of the Reagan jokes are this is a guy who's patently unqualified.
And sadly, that's so relevant today.
And the Gaddafi stuff, it's Gaddafi, multiple forms before. I mean, the Libyans were the villains in Back to the Future 1. But concerns of terrorism infecting the discourse, the commentary about the National Rifle Association, all of that stuff is just like, it's horrifying how still contemporary it feels.
Yeah.
So I agree that some of that political stuff is just like, oh, you're speaking to a particular time. And during the Clinton era, you'd listen to that and go, oh, isn't that cute?
Yeah.
But now it speaks to our own current times.
Just change the names and
you'd
have the jokes would work.
It's like, thank God we don't have apartheid era South Africa anymore, but everything else is pretty much I found actually that the childhood stuff was probably the most undercooked. It felt the most undercooked in terms of like pure jokes or freneticism. It felt more traditional stereotypes. He wasn't doing men versus women jokes, but he was. And I think they're relatable to people. I have a child now. I remember some of those experiences, and it gives me a smile. It's probably the most accessible stuff. It's probably the least honest stuff on the album. So that's probably the area that I struggle with the most. Back third is what I struggle with, because how do you come out of like that opening 20?
And also distance from a story tends to make the story a bit better. So if his kid was still young and he had only recently gone through that,
a really great
the perspective, the longer you're away, from it, the better you can comment on it. So if it was still new to him, there's insight that he still had to develop there.
Yeah, he still didn't have the answers, which is kind of how he ends the thing.
Right, exactly.
I mean, this isn't a vision. He's not a vision comic who's going to like change the way you look at the world.
Yeah.
But he's got a lot of great jokes about the world that he sees, and good for him on that.
Terrific. Well, any closing thoughts? Anything you'd like to share before we wrap it up?
Great album.
You know what? A joy to go back and revisit this, because for all of those things, and to kind of bring it back personally, it's like he's a guy that I enjoyed his things with my father, and he looks like my father. My father looked like him, and it's nice. There's a weird personal association. Yeah. It was nice to relive that.
Excellent.
Yeah, he's kind. Underneath it all, he's kind, right?
And,
so
that's
a beautiful thing in a takedown era. It reminds you how much we miss that.
Yeah.
Where there is a generosity of spirit in our performing culture at a time where we're also discovering that our heroes are potentially monsters.
Yeah, I think we're going to circle back to kindness a bit more. I think we're due for more of that, and especially with the current climate. There's a lot of I love satire, obviously, but there is so much of it, and it is a lot of well-intentioned. Obviously, everyone wants, to see the right thing be done for people. But I do think there is just a kind of a loose joy that is going to find its way back into everything.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation because, there's a bullying culture regardless of the divide. But these days there's we are in a tribal culture right now. And I think at some point
trolling is humor, and trolling isn't humor. It's being a dick.
Well,
we're due for exactly what you said, Sherilyn. Like we're due for a period where somebody will discover that optimism will win. What connects us will win. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be political. It's going to be emotional.
Yeah.
It's going to be about your core. You're not necessarily punching up or punching down.
It's just connecting.
It's just connection. You're just going to throw some shit out there.
Yeah.
And see what sticks.
Yeah.
And if it kind of gets on somebody, that's probably not so bad. If I didn't mean to throw it at you, Yeah.
Thank you. Big thanks to Peter Hill, who you can find on Twitter at Peter James Hill, and Sherilyn Johnson, who is on Twitter at ThirdB. You can also find me, Matt Ardell, on Twitter at Common Person. Comedy Album Book Club also has its own Twitter account at CABC Podcast, or it can be found at our website, comedyalbumbookclub.com, as well as on Facebook, where you can keep up to date on special events, suggest albums or guests. You can also download us on all your favorite podcast apps. Please rate and subscribe. And once again, thanks for listening to Comedy Album Book Club.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Corient. Corient provides wealth management services centered around you. They focus on exceeding your expectations and simplifying your life. Corient has been helping high achievers just like you enjoy their lives more fully, preserve their wealth, and provide for the people, causes, and communities they care about. As one of the largest integrated fee-only registered investment advisors in the U.S., Corient has deeply experienced teams in 23 strategic locations. Corient has extensive knowledge spanning the full spectrum of planning, investing, lending, and money management disciplines. Leverage Corient's exclusive network of experts to craft custom solutions designed to help you reach your financial goals, no matter how complex they may be. Real wealth requires real solutions. For more information, connect with a wealth advisor today at Corient.com. That's Corient.com. Corient.com. Looks like you need a vacation. Enter the 5-Hour Energy Where Will the Tide Take You sweepstakes. You could win a $10,000 dream beach vacation. Imagine jet setting off to a tropical paradise, having fun in the sun, or diving at a gorgeous reef. It's up to you. No purchase necessary. Go to 5HETide.com for official rules and to enter. That's 5HETide.com. Enter today. Ends June 30th, 2024.